The forest was already dying when the regiment realized the maps were wrong. What should have been a routine advance had turned into a slow, tightening noose. The trees, thick, wet, and clawing at every sound, swallowed radio signals. Artillery echoes arrived seconds late, distorted as if the earth itself was confused about where the fighting actually was. Somewhere ahead, German guns were repositioning. Somewhere behind, the supply road was gone. And in between, nearly 1,000 men were trapped. This was late 1944. The weather had turned without warning. Rain soaked uniforms until they clung like armor made of ice. Boots rotted from the inside out. Rifles jammed. And the regiment, already under strength, was now completely cut off from higher command. No contact. No resupply. No extraction route. The enemy knew it. By the third night, flares were rising beyond the tree line in deliberate intervals. Not random, not probing. It was measurement. The Germans were mapping the perimeter by sound, listening to coughs, metal clicks, the scrape of boots in mud. Every flare marked another few yards of certainty. Inside the pocket, officers whispered over maps that no longer mattered. Runners had already been sent, 2 of them. Neither returned. By dawn, mortar fire began walking inward. The regiment commander understood what that meant. This wasn't harassment. This was preparation. Once the ring tightened enough, the Germans would seal the exits and reduce the pockets systematically, section by section, trench by trench. No heroics, no grand assault, just elimination. If help didn't come within 48 hours, the regiment would cease to exist. And that was when one man stepped forward. He was not the tallest, not the loudest, not the one anyone expected to volunteer. He was already wounded, shrapnel in the leg, blood dried stiff along his trousers. He had been ordered to the rear hours earlier, but never went. When he spoke, it wasn't dramatic. "I can get through." The commander stared at him. 30 miles lay between their position and the nearest friendly division. Not road miles, enemy-held ground miles. Broken villages, artillery zones, patrol corridors. A distance that even a healthy runner would struggle to cross in perfect conditions. This man would walk it. Alone. No escort, no radio, no guarantee he'd even be believed if he made it. The commander shook his head. Others had tried shorter routes and vanished. The forests were crawling with German infantry, field gendarmes, and listening posts. Any movement at night drew fire. Any movement by day drew observation. The soldier didn't argue. "If I don't go," he said, "they die." There was nothing heroic in his tone, just arithmetic. The commander finally nodded. Maps were spread on a crate, pencil lines drawn and redrawn. A route that bent around known strongpoints, crossed streams instead of roads, and avoided villages entirely. It wasn't safe. It was simply less impossible. Before he left, the soldier removed everything unnecessary. Helmet gone. Pack stripped to rations and a canteen. Rifle left behind, too heavy, too loud. He carried only a sidearm and a compass that had already taken shrapnel. As night fell, the regiment watched him disappear between the trees. They did not cheer. They did not salute. They watched silently, because every man there understood the truth. This was not a mission meant to succeed. This was a delay, tactic written in human form. Within minutes, the forest swallowed him. No footsteps, no signal, just darkness and rain. Behind him, the regiment dug deeper. Ammunition was counted down to the magazine. Medical supplies were rationed to minutes, not days. Mortar rounds crept closer. Ahead of him lay 30 miles of enemy-controlled hell. And somewhere in that darkness, German patrols were already moving. Unaware, that one wounded soldier had begun a walk that would decide whether an entire regiment lived or died. The first mile was the hardest, not because of distance, but because of restraint. Every instinct told him to move fast, to put ground behind him before the pocket collapsed. But speed meant noise. Noise meant death. So he walked the way hunted men always walk, slow, deliberate, listening more than moving. The forest floor was a trap. Wet leaves masked holes. Broken branches snapped under careless weight. Somewhere to his left, a machine gun coughed once, testing. Somewhere ahead, boots moved in pairs, not squads. Patrols, close. He adjusted immediately. The route on the map had been an idea. Reality rewrote it step by step. He abandoned straight lines and began drifting, curving around sound, angling away from anything man-made. Roads were death. Trails were worse. Germans defended predictability, not emptiness. By the second mile, his wounded leg began to fail him. Shrapnel had torn muscle, not bone, but every step sent a hot pulse through his thigh. Blood had clotted hours ago, but the swelling was worse now. He wrapped it tighter with a strip torn from his undershirt, cinched until his hands shook. Stopping was not an option. If he stopped, the pain would catch up. If the pain caught up, fear would follow. Fear was louder than footsteps. Near the third mile, the forest thinned, and that nearly killed him. Open ground meant visibility. Moonlight reflected off wet grass, turning the clearing into a shallow silver bowl. He dropped immediately, flattening himself into the earth, breath locked in his chest. Moments later, a German patrol crossed the far edge. 6 men, rifles slung, helmets dark against the sky. They moved with the confidence of soldiers who believed the area was already sealed. One laughed softly, another struck a match, then thought better of it and crushed it out. They passed within 40 yards, close enough that he could smell tobacco. He did not move until the silence returned. By the 4th mile, artillery began to speak again, not near him, but behind him. The regiment. The Germans had begun tightening the pocket. He could feel the concussions through the ground, faint but unmistakable. That meant the clock had started. Every hour he failed to reach friendly lines meant fewer men would still be alive when help arrived, if help arrived at all. The 5th mile ended at water. A stream, swollen by rain, cutting across his path at an angle. The banks were slick and exposed. He knelt, listening. Water masked sound, but it also attracted patrols. Germans knew Americans crossed here. He entered anyway. Cold slammed into him like a blow. He gasped once, almost too loud, then forced himself under, submerging completely. He moved downstream, half crawling, half floating, letting the current do the work while keeping his head just below the surface. Branches clawed at him. Stones tore skin from his palms. His legs screamed. He emerged 200 yards down, soaked, shaking, but unseen. 5 miles behind him. 25 still ahead. By dawn, exhaustion began doing what bullets had not. His thoughts slowed, distances stretched, simple decisions took effort. This was the dangerous phase, not panic, but dullness. Men didn't die because they were afraid. They died because they stopped paying attention. He forced routines onto himself. Count steps. Check compass. Listen for 30 seconds before moving. Drink once every mile, no more. Mid-morning brought the village. It wasn't on the map. 3 stone buildings, a collapsed barn, and a road he hadn't planned to see until nightfall. Smoke rose thinly from a chimney. That meant Germans, or civilians under German orders. He circled wide, crawling through a drainage ditch that smelled of rot. His uniform was no longer a uniform, just wet cloth and mud. Rank insignia gone, identity erased. At the far end of the village, he heard voices arguing. German sharp, frustrated. A field telephone rang. He froze. That sound meant command presence, officers. That meant this area mattered. He waited nearly an hour before moving again. When he did, it was slower than before. Because now he understood something clearly. The enemy wasn't just hunting the regiment. They were controlling the ground between it and salvation. By the time he reached the 10th mile marker, measured only by his own counting, the pain had become background noise. Hunger replaced it. Thirst gnawed harder. And somewhere behind him, the regiment was burning through its ammunition faster than planned. He did not know their status. He did not know if he was already too late. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty. The easy part was over. Night returned without mercy. There was no gradual dimming, no gentle transition. Clouds rolled in low and heavy, smothering the moon and turning the forest into a solid wall of black. This was the kind of darkness that erased distance, that made a man feel blind even with his eyes open. He welcomed it and feared it. Darkness hid him from observation, but it also hid the enemy until they were nearly on top of him. By the 12th mile, hunger had sharpened into something distracting. He allowed himself half a ration bar, chewing slowly, forcing it down without pleasure. Too much food now would slow him, dull him. Everything was measured. Water was worse. His canteen was already half gone, and he could not risk refilling from every stream. Dysentery could kill just as surely as a bullet. He rationed to sips, wetting his mouth, not his stomach. Somewhere ahead, a dog barked. He dropped instantly. Dogs were rare this far forward, but when they appeared, they meant patrol bases or field headquarters. He crawled until his elbows burned, moving at an angle, circling the sound rather than avoiding it outright. That decision saved his life. Minutes later, a flare erupted behind him, white, harsh, turning night into a frozen photograph. He pressed his face into the mud, heart hammering, every muscle screaming not to move. Shadows shifted. Boots approached. German voices, close enough now that he could hear individual words, the clink of gear, the scrape of leather. They were sweeping, not searching, confident, systematic. A rifle butt struck the ground 10 yards away. A voice cursed softly. Then something brushed his boot. A hand. He did not think. The pistol was already in his hand, wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. He fired once, point blank. The shot was a dull cough, almost lost under the flare's hiss. The German collapsed onto him, weight sudden and suffocating. He caught the body, lowered it, held it until the muscles went slack. No second shot. No shout. The patrol passed within seconds, unaware that one of their own lay dead in the mud. When the flare burned out, he did not move. Not for 5 minutes. Not for 10. Only when the forest returned to its unnatural silence did he pull free. His hands shook, not from fear but from delayed reaction. This was the cost of silence, close work, personal. He wiped the pistol clean, checked the body quickly, maps, nothing useful, and melted back into the trees. The next hours blurred. He walked, stopped, listened, walked again. Pain ebbed and surged. His legs stiffened dangerously. He forced movement, knowing that once it locked, he would not unlock it again. Near dawn, artillery thundered again, closer this time. Not from behind. From his right. That meant the Germans were advancing laterally, closing corridors. The net was tightening not just around the regiment, but around the land itself. By the 15th mile, he began hallucinating sounds, voices where there were none, footsteps that vanished when he focused. He recognized the signs: sleep deprivation, dehydration, stress stacking on injury. He slapped his own face once, hard. It helped. Barely. He crossed a rail line at first light, crawling beneath it rather than stepping over. The metal was cold, vibrating faintly from distant traffic. Trains meant supply routes. Supply routes meant heavy patrols. He moved fast here, accepting risk to minimize exposure. That was when he saw the bodies. Two Americans face down near a drainage culvert. No weapons, no boots, runners, the ones sent before him. He did not stop. Stopping would mean acknowledging what that meant. He pressed on, jaw set, eyes burning. By mid-morning, he reached a ridgeline overlooking farmland. This was the worst possible terrain. Open, rolling, watched. He waited hours for cloud cover, then began moving diagonally, staying low, using hedgerows like lifelines. Twice, aircraft passed overhead, German fighters hunting ground movement. He froze both times, heart in his throat. 20 miles. 2/3 of the way. His body was failing, but his purpose had narrowed into something almost mechanical. Reach friendly lines. Deliver coordinates. Bring artillery and armor. Nothing else mattered. As evening approached, he allowed himself the second half of the ration bar. It tasted like dust. Behind him, the regiment was now fighting with grenades and bayonets. He did not know that, but the sound of sustained fire carried on the wind told him time was nearly gone. When darkness fell again, he entered the last third of the march. This was where survival stopped being likely, and where resolve had to replace strength. The road appeared without warning. One moment there was hedgerow and ditch, the next there was crushed gravel and the faint sheen of oil reflecting starlight. He froze at the edge, pulse hammering in his ears. This was not a village road. This was military. Ruts cut deep by half-drags, fresh tire marks, cigarette embers glowing faintly near the tree line. Somewhere ahead, an engine idled, then cut. A roadblock. He counted the sounds before he counted the men. Metal on metal, 2 vehicles. Voices, at least a squad, maybe more. A radio, short bursts, disciplined. This wasn't a casual checkpoint. This was a choke point designed to catch exactly what he was. He backed away inch by inch, but the terrain betrayed him. Open fields to the left, a shallow drainage ditch to the right that led directly under the road. It was madness. Culverts were obvious. Germans checked them, but the alternative was crossing open ground under starlight. He waited nearly an hour, watching patterns. The Germans were bored. They joked, shifted positions. One wandered off to urinate at regular intervals. Complacency was not kindness, it was opportunity. When clouds finally swallowed the stars, he moved. He slid into the ditch, mud sucking at his legs, water rising instantly to his knees. The culvert was narrow, too narrow. He exhaled and crawled forward, chest scraping stone, pistol held flat against his body. Halfway through, his wounded leg spasmed. He bit down on his sleeve to keep from crying out. Above him, boots passed. A voice cursed about the cold. Something dripped into the water, oil or fuel. He did not look. The culvert ended in a tangle of weeds and trash. He lay still, half submerged, listening to the roadblock fade behind him. When he finally stood, His leg nearly buckled. That mile took nearly 3 hours. And it broke something inside him. Pain was no longer something to manage. It was a constant presence, grinding, unrelenting. His gait changed. His pace slowed. He began compensating without realizing it, putting strain on muscles already exhausted. This was how men died days after battles, not from bullets, but from collapse. At the 23rd mile, the weather turned again. Rain fell hard and cold, flattening sound and soaking him through. His hands lost feeling. The pistol slipped once. He caught it just in time. He began talking to himself, not out loud, but in fragments, counting, repeating names, anything to anchor reality. Just before dawn, he saw movement ahead and nearly fired. American helmets. The relief almost dropped him to his knees, but training stopped him. No challenge meant nothing. Units had been overrun before. Uniforms could be taken. He watched for 10 minutes, listening to accents, posture, the lazy sprawl of men who believed they were safe. Finally, he stepped out. Rifles snapped up instantly. Hands grabbed him, forced him down. Password. He didn't know it. That nearly ended everything. A sergeant recognized the division patch, caked in mud but still visible. An officer knelt, stared at his face, then swore softly. Jesus, where did you come from? He tried to answer and couldn't. Words failed. His body gave up. He collapsed where he stood, consciousness sliding away as medics rushed in. 30 miles. He had made it. But the regiment was still dying. As he faded, he forced out the last thing that mattered: grid references, terrain descriptions, enemy dispositions. He spoke until his throat bled. Officers wrote furiously. Artillery officers leaned in. Maps changed. When he finally lost consciousness, the decision had already been made. Armor would move at first light. Guns would fire without delay. An entire division would pivot on the testimony of one wounded man who had walked through hell to deliver it. Dawn broke with violence. Not the slow, hopeful light soldiers prayed for, but a tearing roar that split the morning apart. Artillery opened fire in rolling sequence, battery after battery, timed to the second. The ground shook. Windows shattered miles away. Birds erupted from trees in black clouds. For the trapped regiment, it was the first good sound they had heard in days. The shells did not fall randomly. They walked with purpose, across ridgelines, into tree lines, along the very corridors the Germans had been using to tighten the pocket. Fire that had once crept inward now slammed outward. Men looked up from foxholes and trenches in disbelief. That wasn't German artillery. That was friendly steel. The German command reacted instantly, but too late. Radios crackled with confused reports. Forward units called for clarification that never came. Fire plans meant to crush a surrounded enemy suddenly became death traps. American armor moved as soon as the last guns lifted. Tanks did not rush. They advanced methodically, crushing hedgerows, ignoring small arms fire, trusting the artillery plan written only hours earlier, based almost entirely on one man's exhausted words and memory. Inside the pocket, the regiment sensed the shift before they saw it. German pressure slackened. Attacks lost coordination. Mortar fire overshot or fell short. Patrols that had once moved confidently now hesitated. A runner reached the regimental command post with the news. Armor moving east. ETA uncertain. The commander closed his eyes for a moment. The soldier had made it. The counterattack did not break the pocket in one blow. It tore at it, inch by inch, forcing the Germans to choose between holding ground and surviving. By midday, smoke hung thick over the forest, masking movement and confusing observation. That smoke saved lives. German units began pulling back, not retreating, adjusting. But adjustment under artillery meant casualties. Positions that had taken days to prepare were abandoned in minutes. By afternoon, the first American tank broke through the outer ring. Men cheered until their voices cracked. Others simply sat and stared, unable to process that they were still alive. The regiment was evacuated in stages, wounded first, then the exhausted, then the rest. They left behind shallow grave, burned-out positions, and a battlefield that would soon be reclaimed by silence. At the field hospital, the man who made it possible lay unconscious, legs swollen and blackened with infection. Surgeons worked without knowing his name. Medics cleaned wounds that had been ignored for days. When he woke, the war had already moved on. He asked one question. Did they get out? The nurse nodded. All of them. He closed his eyes again. He would never walk without pain. He would never speak much about what he had done. His report would become an annex in an after-action file, buried under larger operations and louder victories. But hundreds of men would go home because of 30 miles walked through hell. And somewhere, deep in a forest that no longer remembered their names, the earth still bore the scars of a regiment that refused to vanish, and of one man who refused to let it. The paperwork took longer than the battle. Reports were written, rewritten, condensed, and finally sanitized. Numbers replaced names. Movements replaced moments. What had been chaos and desperation on the ground became arrows on maps and paragraphs in binders. The man who had walked 30 miles appeared only briefly. Runner successfully reached friendly lines under extreme conditions. No adjectives. No explanation. No sense of scale. In the hospital, he learned how close everything had come to failing. The regiment had been hours from collapse. Ammunition had dropped below critical levels. Medical officers had begun preparing morphine not for pain, but for mercy. His arrival had shifted everything by less than half a day. It had been enough. A citation was discussed. Higher headquarters debated details. Verification was difficult. There were no witnesses to his march, only the absence of a regiment from the casualty lists. In the end, he received a medal few outside the army would recognize. The citation spoke of extraordinary endurance and successful transmission of vital intelligence. It did not mention the roadblock, or the culvert, or the man who died in the mud. After recovery, he returned to duty, not to the front, but to training units. His leg never fully healed. He walked with a slight hitch that worsened in cold weather. He was younger than most men around him and felt decades older. He did not talk about the march. When asked, he shrugged it off. Someone had to go. Years later, veterans of the regiment would meet at reunions and argue about who had volunteered first, who had wanted to go, who would have made it. None of them had. They raised glasses to a man who rarely attended. History prefers explosions and speeches. It struggles with endurance, with suffering measured in miles instead of minutes. The war moved on. New battles swallowed old ones. Records were boxed, archived, forgotten. But among the men who lived, the story remained sharp. 30 miles. One man. A regiment that came home. Decades later, the forest looked ordinary. Trees grew where shells had fallen. Roads were repaved. Fields returned to crops. To anyone passing through, it was just another quiet stretch of countryside. No markers, no plaques, no indication that nearly 1,000 men had once waited there for extinction. That was how most wars ended. Not with closure, but with forgetting. The man who walked 30 miles returned to civilian life, carrying no visible heroism. He worked ordinary jobs. He married. He aged. His limp worsened with time, a small physical reminder of something no one around him could truly understand. He rarely spoke about the war, and never about the march. When people did learn fragments of it, usually second-hand, they assumed exaggeration. 30 miles sounded too neat, too cinematic. Surely there had been shortcuts. Surely others had helped. There hadn't been. The men of the regiment knew the truth, but even they struggled to explain it. How do you describe a debt that can never be repaid? How do you thank someone for your entire life? At reunions, the story always surfaced eventually, not as a boast, but as a quiet acknowledgement, a pause in conversation, a moment where voices lowered and eyes drifted away. Because survival carries weight. Every child born to those men. Every life built afterward. Every ordinary day that followed. All of it traced back to one decision made in the rain, in the dark, by a wounded soldier who understood that doing nothing was worse than almost certain death. History would never frame it that way. There would be no statues of a man walking alone through mud, no dramatic speeches carved into stone. The archives would record an extraction, a counterattack, a successful maneuver. But somewhere between the lines, between the arrows and dates, lived the truth. Wars are not won only by generals. They are won by endurance, by silence, by men who walk when running is impossible, by those who accept that they may not survive and go anyway. 30 miles is not a great distance on a map. But under fire, wounded, hunted, starving and alone, it might as well be the width of hell itself. And one man crossed it, so that others would not have to.